Now, I'm sure, as I said, I'm sure that the other reason that Jesus spoke to his disciples in private was that he knew what their response would be. On the first occasion, Peter's response was, as I said, protective of his friend and teacher. And Matthew records it in more detail than Mark. God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. Peter's reverted to type now, hasn't he? He's opened his mouth and he's put his foot in it. Because we know Jesus' response. It's quite a strong one, isn't it? Get behind me, Satan. He's not likening Peter to Satan, but he's recognising the underlying root of what Peter was saying. That it was a spiritual attack and a temptation to go to deviate from God's path. Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Remember that. We'll come back to it. On the second occasion, we read that the disciples did not understand what Jesus meant. And so, perhaps put off by Jesus' rebuke of Peter, they were afraid to ask him. They kept quiet. And the third time that Jesus predicted his death, instead of telling Jesus off for believing it or staying fearfully quiet, two of his disciples, James and John, changed the subject and basically said, "Okay, Jesus, if you must die, do us a favour, please. Let one of us sit on your right-hand side and one of us on your left-hand side in glory." Now, all of those responses were very human responses to Jesus' prediction. And I wonder how often we react to what God is doing by thinking in a human way rather than by having the things of God in mind. I wonder whether the disciples simply couldn't get beyond the idea that Jesus was saying he was going to die. They were putting their hands over their ears like a teenager saying, "Not listening, not listening." And as a result, they missed the amazing promise in all three predictions that after 3 days, Jesus would defeat death and rise again as a sign of the new life that he gives us when we follow him. Jesus took all three misunderstandings as opportunities to teach his friends what it means to live as his followers. And we haven't got time to go into the detail of that teaching. But basically he taught that it involves personal sacrifice. It involves putting others first at our expense. After all, that is the example that Jesus modelled on the cross. And it's the example that models the way of God rather than of humanity. And it's the example that leads to new resurrection life. And so as we draw to a close, I wonder, in what ways is God challenging us at the moment to have his concerns in mind rather than our own? Imagine for a moment, in what small ways do we experience the position that Jesus found himself in? Perhaps we've experienced it on the occasions when we've approached the end of a contract or a job. Perhaps we experience it when we realise that we're going to have to make some sort of sacrifice for our children or for a friend. Perhaps we experience it when we realise that we simply have less life left now than we've already lived. How do we respond? Do we respond by burying our heads in the sand, becoming like those teenagers and saying, "Not listening," and therefore becoming totally ineffective? No. Surely we respond by preparing the next generation to pick up where we will leave off. That's what I focused on during my last few months with Surrey Police before training for this job, on making sure that others could pick up where I left off so that the people we were serving there had a hopefully seamless transition. For Jesus, on the one hand, this was a time of frustration as he struggled to get his closest friends ready, as he struggled to get them to understand what was going on. But on the other hand, it was one of the busiest, most important, and most fruitful times of his ministry. Think about it. Jesus lived 33 years. His life is represented on the left-hand side there. A little bit of birth account in blue at the top. A total of 33 years, and his ministry is represented by that brownish patch at the bottom. One brief line at the age of 12 where we read about his visit to Jerusalem. But the Gospel accounts, only Matthew and Luke touch briefly on his birth. The Gospel accounts have a little bit about his birth. Otherwise, they cover the 3 years of his ministry at the end of his life. They all cover that little brown bit at the bottom there. But actually, a third of the Gospels covers just the 1 week up to his death. 1/3, covering that tiny little red bit on the left-hand side at the bottom, which I've had to make much thicker than it really should be. Doesn't that tell you that that was the most important part of Jesus' life and ministry? 1/3 of the Gospels covers 2/3 of 1% of Jesus' 3-year ministry. If I've got my maths right, it covers 6/100ths of 1% of his whole life. That was when the significant stuff was done. It included preparing his disciples for his impending death, but more importantly, he was starting to prepare them not for Good Friday or even for Resurrection Sunday, but for Pentecost and beyond, for their future role in leading the church. Now, we might, for whatever reason, in whatever context, think that our time has been and gone. But what if our most significant work and ministry is yet to come? What if your most significant work and ministry is in the future, not the past? As we pray in and draw alongside those who will follow us, as we train them up and prepare them for their part in the future life and ministry of the church here. Jesus' example shows us that the time that we have left really can be the most significant part of our life and service for him. The challenge is, are we ready to assume that attitude and approach? Amen.